Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to this month's webinar breaking down how to make AML work for your collectors. To kick things off, we're going to do a quick breakdown, a kind of status update on what's been happening. I think we've all been seeing a lot of scary headlines around some big fines hitting the art market. So we thought we'd break down what that means for you and how to make sure that you can stay ahead of any increased enforcement. Then we're going to bring Bethany on, our VP of Customers, to discuss how to handle tough conversations with your collectors and navigate some of the trickier parts of AML. Also, just letting you know, this webinar is part of an ongoing series we've been running to help make all of this due diligence, compliance, regulation a bit more approachable. So we've already got 2 episodes out, one looking at sanctions, the other one looking at manual due diligence. So another next step if you're interested in something to watch after today's chat. But lots to get into, so let's dive in. So recently we've been seeing lots of headlines about huge fines hitting the art market. Last week, the art newspaper reported on the largest fine yet, with a single gallery having to pay over £150,000 to HMRC. This also isn't just one big fine, but the average fine is also increasing to about £6,000, and we're seeing many more fines sitting in that £20,000 to £30,000 range. HMRC actually publishes a big list of all their enforcement actions, so you can watch this uptick in enforcement happen in real time. Now, this might seem a bit surprising. You know, the law was introduced in 2020 and there haven't been any major regulatory updates since then. So why are we seeing, much more significant fines recently compared to what we saw, 2021, 2022? Well, when the laws were first introduced, HMRC approached enforcement with a pretty high degree of leniency. Most of the fines were being handed out for late registration and were pretty low level. I think this was given the opportunity for the market to kind of catch up to the requirements and kind of understand what they need to do. But really now we're 5 years on, and I think that there is an increasing expectation from all regulatory bodies across both the UK and Europe that you've had your time to kind of understand what's required of you. And there kind of aren't any excuses anymore if you're not registered, if you're not doing proper due diligence on sales above the threshold. This is why we're seeing fines move from being focused on late registration to fines that look at non-compliance and having inadequate systems and procedures. At the end of the day, art market AML regulations are built off the same core pillars. These are things you should already have done. So being registered with your regulator, having a risk assessment and policy document, doing training with the appropriate staff members, and doing due diligence on sales above €10,000. For more established industries like banking, they're years ahead of us. They're used to dealing with this extra burden of compliance. And I think it can be useful as a way of seeing kind of where the industries are headed. Banking, they have large-scale compliance departments. And really, it's just how they do business. It's considered, normal practice. Now, of course, no one is going to say that your gallery is going to need a banking-style compliance department. But we are moving this to the stage with AML that you need to have strong systems in place to deal with this stuff. The more that you make it just how you do business, the more confidence you give regulators, but also the more confidence you give your own collectors. If your AML procedure is just part of your sales process and you've got the basics right, then you've got nothing to worry about in the case of an intervention. There are also benefits to regulation becoming more embedded in the art market. When we talk to top galleries, more and more collectors are expecting it as just a normal part of buying work. They've got their documents prepared and they're expecting the question as part of the sale. And we see this in our own data as well, with 1 in 3 profiles undergoing due diligence in Arcata having been through the process before. But we do understand that for collectors that aren't used to AML, it can still feel like a big ask. And when you get pushback from collectors, it can be hard to know what to say. So let's bring in Betsy for a bit of a chat about how to handle those tough conversations. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course.
Tough conversations with collectors. It's something we hear about a lot from the galleries we work with. How do you approach the AML conversation, especially with collectors you've worked with for years? It's a new obligation. So where do you think this resistance comes from? Why do you think some people react negatively to having to share this info?
I mean, it's a good question and it's something we are very aware of and familiar with. I think you touch on an interesting point in the fact that it is a relatively new thing in the market. So regardless of what we are asking, it's a new process, and people are still getting their heads around it. Ultimately, though, I see that there is friction because it feels invasive. We're asking people to share information that they otherwise haven't before, and also it can be quite a big admin headache. If you do not have these documents ready, and if you are trying to sort of move forward with the sale quite quickly, there's a few extra steps involved.
So when it comes to explaining the regulations to clients, there's obviously a lot going on with regulation. Yes. So how do you keep it simple for your collectors?
No, it is a good point, because I think I myself even get in the habit of not keeping it simple. And, we should always explain these things as if it's in the most simplest sense. I really liked a few weeks ago, I had a client say to me they try to make it a non-event to their client. And I think that's because, when we are going into, let's use the example of a pricing discussion over an artwork, when we are asked what the price is of a piece, we need to express that with confidence, express it with clarity. The price is what the price is, so the regulation is what the regulation is. I think when we try and overcomplicate it and sort of say, approach it with a bit of hesitancy or caution or apprehension, a collector will sniff that out on you. And we want to communicate this with 100% clarity and confidence and make it a non-event. And I think it's a really nice tactic. And of course, if you want to have like a little script in the back of your mind, I think that's a really good thing. Explaining, I need to collect these documents to satisfy the AML regulation in the UK. It should only take you a couple of minutes. Done. And then, of course, if we get some pushback, you can give us a call and we can help you.
Nice. Another classic thing we hear from galleries is, I collected a passport, maybe I collected a bank statement as a proof of address. Why isn't that enough?
Yeah, I think, look, thank goodness they're doing that, because at least you have a good starting point. First and foremost, you will not satisfy all areas of the regulation by simply collecting an ID document, a national ID, passport, driver's license, and a proof of address. As I said, it's a good starting point, but what you are not then doing to support that record keeping and that document obtainment is then also making sure that, is this person politically exposed? Are they sanctioned? Have they got any criminal activity? Are they part of any regulatory enforcement lists? Now, these are what we refer to as negative information, which are the big red flags for the regulation. Without a system in place, without a service behind it to check those points, those data points, it's going to be really hard to obtain a full picture and a full financial picture on who this client is. At least so having a driver's license and perhaps a proof of address is a really good starting point, but it's not going to be able to give you the full picture on this client, nor is it going to protect our business in the case of an audit.
Totally. So it's a little bit more involved there. And so speaking of negative information, what do you do if you get a red flag on a client, you can't proceed with the sale?
Yes, I think I mentioned earlier, it's always important to communicate things with clarity. So if you do get a red flag on a client, first of all, within our Carta, if you are using our services, you will be notified on what that red flag is. Now, there's a variety of different red flags. It could be something as simple as the passport has expired, therefore it's non-compliant. We'd need to get a new passport. But then we might have more significant red flags within the negative information section. They're politically exposed, that would come up. They are sanctioned, that would definitely come up. Obviously, then we have obligations to take the necessary steps on those findings. It may be re-requesting documents, it may be asking for additional documentation, or it may be putting pause on that interaction with the client while we assess what the necessary next steps are.
And as an art market participant, do you have more obligations to do any reporting, or if you decide to not proceed with the sale, what would be involved there?
Definitely. It really depends on the outcome of your assessment. There's a variety of different reasons why people might decide not to work with certain individuals or certain companies. And obviously that will be down to the business and their risk appetite. But there is usually two main reasons why we would not be able to work with someone. The first being that someone is on a sanctions list, we cannot work with them. In that case, we would need to notify OFSI. Now, that was a pretty significant change that occurred on the 14th of May this year within the regulation. And to be honest, there have definitely been tools that have been implemented since then, like periodic checking within our Carta to really sort of keep you on top of any changes within your client base. So the other type of instance where you may not be able to work with a client is due to suspicious activity. Now, at that instance is when you would need to file a suspicious activity report. Of course, if that is ever sort of apparent within your client base, please do let us know because we can support you in taking the next steps with your client base. It is really important though, just to bear in mind that when you are submitting a suspicious activity report, to not tip off the client, which is basically to let them know that there may be further steps into the investigation around them.
So we've covered a lot there. Is there any one key takeaway if a gallery's just tuned into the webinar, one thing that they walk away from this? No.
I think the most important thing for any art business is to ensure that you have reliable structures around you to safeguard your business. At the end of the day, what we are dealing with is quite complex. The nature of regulation is always evolving. And I think within that, we cannot rely on a manual process, but nor can we fully rely on tools. We have to have a really nice blend of a sort of personal insight into the collector reports, obviously, and then we also have to have sort of the programmatic element to help take that manual work off our shoulders. I think with a lot of the clients that I work with, they do feel this sense of overwhelm and burden when they first come to us, and that's because there is this sort of natural feeling of fatigue around the regulation, just because it has come in quite quickly, it changes quite fast as well, so there's always this sort of I guess you're running on the treadmill. When we are then also dealing with everything else in our gallery, we're dealing with sales, exhibitions, art fairs, collectors, it's a lot. I think when you do have a system in place that you can lean on, it becomes a lot more scalable, it becomes a lot more manageable. And I guess more importantly, of course, if there is anything today that we haven't talked about that you're interested in as an AMP, or maybe you're just starting to make sales over that threshold, get in touch. It's always sensible to benchmark what you are doing against what others are doing. It doesn't mean that you have to join our Carta straight away, of course. We would love you to, but it is, I think, just getting an idea of sort of the industry standard, and also how can I look after my business, look after my people, look after my artists, and protect the integrity of the art market going forward with sort of scalable solutions in place.
Totally. Oh, well, as insightful as always. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us today. We're always looking for more topics and questions to help answer. So if you're unsure about anything from today or would like us to cover something in the future, please get in touch. And of course, if you're looking to simplify your compliance and keep sales moving, visit arcata.com.